Today I'm going to show you how to paint a portrait in watercolour. I'm going to show you an easy process to paint portraits from start to finish. You don't need any special skill or talent to be able to do this. In fact, you don't need to have ever painted before. For those of you new to portraiture, I have two separate videos on selecting a reference image and the equipment I use. I'm going to keep my palette there so you can see what I'm doing the whole time. So the way I'm going about this is I'm going to build the painting up in layers, progressively getting darker as I'm going to slowly sculpt the form of the human face from the lightest to the darkest. So start by identifying the lightest lights. In this reference image, the lightest lights are just the face on the left. And it's just the right hand side of the face that's catching the lightest part of the light. So I'm going to paint the rest of the image in this very dilute sepia watercolour. I'm using a 1-inch flat brush to cover the page quickly. It allows me to get a relatively even coverage. So I'm just using this flat brush to mark in the big shapes in this part of the face. So here's the nose. There's a bit of a shadow coming down the right side of the nose. And then I'm going down the edge of the nose there. The advantage of this 1-inch flat brush is it makes you concentrate on getting the big shapes in at this point. So I'm going to look at the side of the neck now. So we can see that there's a silhouette of the neck form which I'll mark in. Obviously it's much darker than this in the reference photo. We're going to build the colour on this, so I'm just leaving the very whitest whites at the moment. So the areas I'm focusing on is the edge of the nose, the edge of the neck and the edge of the cheek and a little bit of the ear. Just using the edge of the flat brush now to get slightly more detail in without changing to my other brushes. The more I can do with this one brush, the more consistent the colour is. So there's the ear, and then I can just mark in the middle helix of the ear there. So I know you can't see much at this point, but you can see just the slight patch of white that I've left. So the edge of the nose, the cheek, and the edge of the neck. I can't see any bright white on the face on the right, so I've completely filled that in with wash. Okay, so I'm just going to jump forward, having let this dry a little bit, so I can go back in with a smaller flat brush. Okay, so it's not completely dry, but with watercolour, if you get used to moving around the painting, working in the areas that are dry while other areas dry, it allows you to keep going and not wait around too long waiting for the whole painting to dry. So I'm just coming back in with a 1/2-inch flat brush now. Still trying to keep to the big shapes, so that's why I'm still using the flat brush. It just gives me a little bit more control. So I'm just mapping in the edge of the muscle in the neck, the sternocleidomastoid muscle, and then coming up here, which is the nasolabial fold, the fold between the cheek and the mouth. And then I'm just going to map in the ala of the nose now, coming up to the nasal bridge. I think it's these features that are most crucial to getting a likeness to your reference. Trying to get these shadow forms in as accurately as possible, but as I say, looking at the bigger shapes as opposed to too fine a detail. The rest of it over to the left of the sitter is much darker, so I can just sweep the water over into that shadow zone, and it just means I don't have a hard line of paint staining the paper. Whereas obviously I want the hard line on the right of the sitter, because that's where I'm forming the light shapes. Okay, so looking at the ear now, I'm just trying to map in the antihelix and the helix of the ear. The antihelix is that bit of cartilage inside the ear, and then I'm just going to come up and I can see where the hair is. It's obviously all darker than that light patch on the right of the forehead, so I can just paint through that. There's a bit of a shadow coming from the eye to the hairline, and that's the zygomatic arch, the cheekbone that's forming that surface that's reflecting the light. But just next to that, I'm putting a little bit of water in there, just so that it gives a bit of depth to that cheekbone. You can see in my palette I've got a watery mix that I'm just going back to, so I'm not having to really put my brush in the water because the mix itself is already quite dilute. It's one of the advantages of using watercolour paint out of the tube, but you can do this from the pan as well if you just form this mix before you start. Okay, so that's looking like a good first layer. I've got in the lights on the right side of the sitter there, and the rest of the painting is covered in a relatively even cover of wash. So I'm going to let this dry a little bit and move on to the mid-tone. Right, so I'm going back to the 1-inch flat brush now, because we're basically doing the same again now, but instead of looking for the absolute brightest whites, we're just going to tone that down a bit and look for the lighter parts. Still, there's not much of this face on the right that has this brightness. It's really just the cheekbone, the zygomatic arch, that's reflecting the most amount of light. So on this side of the painting, I'm just going to leave just that patch. If you watched the video where I selected the reference photo, you'll have seen a trick that I have for doing this is to modify the contrast and brightness, the highlights and shadows, to help you identify these areas of mid-tone. When you first start out, you might find this more helpful, and as you get more used to doing it, you will find you no longer need to do this as much, and it becomes more naturally. I still find myself screwing my eyes up to try and hide the detail so I can just focus on the values. And when I say value, I mean how dark or light a part of the reference photo is. So I can see the forehead. As you can see, I left that patch of white on the right side of the forehead. There's the mid-tone is larger than that patch of white, so I'm coming just halfway across the forehead. The bridge of the nose has quite a sharp line, so I'm just using the edge of the brush here just to mark that sharp line in. And the mouth also has that sharp line as well, so I'm coming there, and the neck as well. So I'm just going to try and indicate the position of the jawline here. Just with a line. And again, I'm just going to go back to the side of the flat brush just to give me a bit more control. So back to the silhouette of the neck. Each time we come to a darker layer, we're going to be coming back to this silhouette of the neck because it's the darkest part of the painting and it highlights the form the best. So I'm just marking in the profile of the neck, the profile of the angle of the mandible, the angle of the jaw, and the profile of the ear and the forehead. Up the top here, the hair is obviously still dark. I've just gone a bit over the forehead there by mistake, so I'm just using a bit of kitchen towel to take that back. If you get there quick enough, the paper won't be too stained and you can almost erase what you've done. A lot of people are quite anxious about using watercolour because there's no way of erasing what you've done. In a way that's true, and sometimes you just got to live with your mistakes and just see them as happy mistakes that make the painting look different to the photo. But if you get there in time with some kitchen towel, you can just take that back. So I'm just really wanting to get the angle of this, the shape of the ear and the angle of the earlobe on the ear accurate here. And then that's the top of the helix, which is where the helix of the ear runs towards the forehead. And then I just want to get the edge of the forehead in there and the edge of the hairline. So we're starting to see more of a recognisable human face. There's a lot of darks on the inside of the orbit socket because the eyes are obviously very sunken in. Try not to go straight to the eye, just look at the big shapes here. So there's a big shadow form that comes down right across the middle of the eye. So I've just drawn that in. Comes down, right down to the inside of the nose and down to the mouth. Okay, so I'm just going to change for the round brush now. At this point, to put in these darker parts of the painting, I find the round brush helps give me more control and helps me define the form more easily. So I'm coming into the eye here. Now, this top of the orbit and bottom of the orbit are always darker because that's what sinks the eye into the profile of the face. So I always tend to go darker here, and then I'm just marking out that inferior orbital margin, the bottom of the eye socket. That shadow passes down towards the nasal flare and actually into the nasolabial sulcus, as we said before. Just start putting in the nostril there. It's going to need to go much darker. And just really defining the ala of the nose, that corner of the nose. Coming down to the jaw while I let that dry, just going to highlight the shadow marks on that part of the cheek and just darken this side of the face more, particularly starting to define the cartilage of the ear and that hairline that comes in front of the ear. Any opportunity I've got when it's dry, I just come and add a bit more colour to this part of the painting because I know it needs to go much darker. So I'm just keeping the brush marks loose for this part, just so I can really start to indicate hair. I'm not worrying about individual strands or anything like that. I'm just indicating the outline of hair, the broken line. Just add a bit more colour here, just to really highlight that silhouette. I really want to make sure I've got that shoulder as a silhouette, so I'll just take that back and come in with a bit of a definite line. I brush away from the line I've made so that there's a less harsh line towards the shadow. I'm just going to do the midline of the neck now. I'm thinking about the way the shadow's falling on the cartilage of the neck, on the angle of the jaw, just so I can start to indicate the anatomy there. I'm going to go back to the 1-inch flat brush now, just to smooth out that shadow line, because I don't want any specific hard margins on this left side of the face, as it's all in shadow. Coming over to the face in profile now, starting to look at what is in halftone. So I've left just the cheek at the moment, the cheekbone, and I'll let that dry before I come back with the darker shadows. You can see the whole middle of my painting now is wet. That's just going to let the paint run, meaning that there's no hard lines there. I've still got a hard line there, so I'll just run some water over that as well. I'm not being too meticulous with it because it adds interest to the background, but I don't want it to be distracting for the eye once it's all dried. That's a good start for the mid-tones of the painting now, so I'm going to leave that to dry and come back to add the darker darks. Now the mid-tone layer is dry, I'm going to use almost pure sepia paint to start adding in the darker parts of the painting. At this point I try and start on the left side of the painting because I'm right-handed, so I don't smudge the darks into the lights. So starting with the silhouette of the neck, remarking this in, At this point you want to be really careful. I'm watching the right border of my paintbrush as I'm doing this, because if you stray over the line you're going to lose that nice form that you're forming on the edge of the neck. I can always come back and straighten that line later, but I'm going to let that dry and keep heading up, keeping the pace up so that I don't develop patches in my dark work. So I'm just going to follow the outline of the ear now. And the top of the ear. And start indicating the side of that forehead. As you can see, I've just accidentally strayed into the forehead there. That's going to have to be one of those happy mistakes that I'm happy to live with. Using the straight flat of the 1-inch brush now, I can just mark in the hairline as it comes down in front of the ear. You can see I'm always starting with the 1-inch brush when I start a layer, and then I drop down to the finer brushes as I start looking at the smaller shapes, but just start by blocking in the large shapes quickly to give your work the most amount of impact and get you started in each layer. Okay, so my plan at this point is to start heading up to the hairline, making sure I've got plenty of paint on my brush, because I really want this to be darker than the mid-tones. A mistake a lot of people make when painting any pictures, but in particularly portraiture, is they get too scared of going too dark, and it's those darks that really highlight the whites, which really give you the sense of the 3D shape. So spot the shapes and go in definitively with your brush, really trying to indicate those 3D shapes. So under the superior orbital ridge here, just putting that in. I'm going right over the eye. It's something that a lot of people are scared of doing. They think of the eye as white, the sclera of the eye as being white. It's not actually white, it's the colour of wherever the light is hitting it. So the eye on the left side of the figure here is totally in dark, and the left side of the right eye is also almost totally in shadow. So I've put the dark paint right over there. As with the nose coming down, I'm aware that it's quite important where I'm putting this mark here, so that I'm thinking about where I want the chin to be. Now, just using the edge of my brush, I'm focusing only on the edge that's closest to the light part of the paint. I'm not worried about the outer part. I'm marking in the bottom of the chin, and then I'm just going to do a rough line along here. I don't want that to be a hard line. That's where the mouth and the lips are, and they're not a hard line like the shadow of the nose. So I'm just using the corner of my square brush to make it a little bit more broken. So I'm just going to change back to the round brush now. The detail in the eye is too small and fine for me to be using that 1-inch flat brush. So I'm just going to really start indicating the depth of the orbit here. So you can see the protrusion of the brow line. I'm going to leave that right side of the sclera without any paint on it, because that's obviously a light part, as is the inferior part of the eyelid. And then just as we come in towards the medial aspect of the nose, where the nose meets the brow, the glabella it's called. I'm just starting to indicate that form, and I think I'm starting to see the face on the right side come together. I'm just going to put in the philtrum, or the dimple under your nose there, and then looking at where the shadow's hitting the lips. Just thinking in big shapes. I'm not worrying about what in particular. Really try not to think about what you anticipate it looks like, and just look at what you can actually see. So it's just a couple of triangles really. Just going to go back to the 1-inch brush just to take this hard edge off this shadow line. So just using almost totally sepia paint with just a bit of water to help it run. I'm just going to drag this paint over the shadow line. Just going to start being careful now not to run this paint over the portrait on the right hand side now, because there are some important midtones that I want to preserve in that profile. So I'm just going to start thinking about marking out where I want the nose of this profile portrait to be, where I want the forehead to be. You can see how I use the brush to kind of mark a hard edge. I look at where the flat edge of the brush is and decide where I'm putting it. There's just a triangle of mid-tone on the forehead there, so I'm just going to leave that shape there, and the rest of it's in dark behind that, so I can fill that in without worry. I've got to be careful because I've got the ear here, so I don't want to go straight over that. There's some mid-tones in the ear, but it's probably darker than the mid-tone on the forehead, so at this point I can paint through that, but I've got to be careful not to go too dark. So I'm just going to indicate the recess in the cheek there, just underneath the cheekbone, underneath the zygomatic bone, and then starting to bring the shadow tone that comes under the chin. But I want to leave that half tone in the neck because there's a little bit of a half tone there, but I can happily fill in the rest of that shadow line. Okay, so I'm going to start looking towards the profile of the nose, getting the silhouette of the nose in and the lip. I really want to make sure this paint's as dark as I can get the sepia while still making it usable with the water. So I'm going to indicate the chin there. And just indicate that medial aspect of the nose. The muzzle of the mouth, if you call it that, is a little bit darker than the cheekbone, so I'm just going to take the value of that down a bit as well. But I'm going to leave the nose at that mid-tone so you can still appreciate the highlights on the nose. There's also a mid-tone just underneath the brow in that glabella region that I mentioned before, where the brow meets the nose. So I'm going to leave that in as well. I'm not being too meticulous, as I've said before, about making sure this shadow tone is all even, because I like the interest added by a variety of tones. That will come through when we add the final dark layer. So this is as dark as we can really go with the sepia. I'm just going to use the round brush now just to add the final details to this dark layer, particularly around the nose, the cheekbone and the brow ridge. That's what's going to give us the appearance of the face side on. So I'm just going to skip forward there to let that layer dry. I'm now going to add Payne's Grey to my palette. This is a cooler tone than the sepia, and painted over the top of the sepia, the cool tone gives the illusion of almost black. I don't like using black in my work because it can be a bit too harsh on the eye, and we lose all that interest that we've spent so long putting into it. So this Payne's Grey almost gives the illusion of black. I'm going to start on the right, even though it's a bit dodgy because I am right-handed and there's a chance I might smudge this, but I wanted to start with the absolute darkest part so I could get my eye in, seeing the darkest darks and the lightest lights at this final point in the painting. You can see I've hardly got any of the shapes of the face in profile on the right in yet, because so much of it's defined by this last layer. So I'm going to start with the ear, making sure I'm leaving that sepia showing through at the points where the ear is formed. The other thing I like about using the Payne's Grey at this point is the sepia is making out the half tones, and it gives the impression of almost a skin colour without us actually adding any skin tones, because the skin tones are made up of the sepia and the background is made a lot cooler by the Payne's Grey. So I'm just going to indicate the top of the ear helix. I've just got to come down just so that I can indicate the cartilage there. Remember, the ear's always a lot lower than you think. The top of the ear is usually in line with the eyes, as opposed to the middle of the ear being in line with the eyes. And you'll usually find the bottom of the ear is in line with the top of the mouth in this view. This study is quite a nice study to do because we're looking at the face from both the front on and the side on views, the anterior view and the lateral view, which helps us appreciate these forms in 3D. So I'm just going to start appreciating where the shadow of the chin falls on the neck. I'm just going to mark that front of the neck in there, dragging the line out into the middle shadow part. You've got to remember that the shadow falling on the neck isn't going to form a hard line unless it's a very direct light. So I'm just going to use the paintbrush more loosely here. Coming down, I've sort of start indicating the front of the face. So I'm following the bone structure round. This is when it's useful to know the anatomy of the face, because you're really just following the skeletal structure here. And then the top is the hair, and then I just want to indicate the front of the forehead there. We've got the eyebrows in. They're so easy to do with this flat brush because it's really just a single stroke. The fewer brush marks you can make in a painting, the more dramatic the overall effect is. So I really try and consider each brush stroke. So I'm just going to form the front of the mouth now, just looking at the space between the upper lip and the bottom lip, and then just start showing in that mental protuberance, the bottom of the chin that protrudes slightly forward. Just going to darken this shadow in the middle so I can see my mid-tones more easily. And then I'm going to switch to a bit more Payne's grey now. I'm using the same palette that I used with the sepia because it just adds a little bit of warmth to the Payne's grey. And I'm going to come in with my round brush. Just going to thickly add the Payne's grey now to this dark shadow on the far side of the face, just to really start bringing those forms forward. It's more difficult on this second profile because I haven't got as many tones to work with. I've really only got the mid-tones and the dark tone, as opposed to the face-on view where I had the white tones as well. So these lines have really got to be well considered when you follow this up from the chin. Just trying to indicate the musculature of the face. So I think that's roughly where my lip is going to be. This would be more easy to appreciate if you had already drawn it out. And it may be that I get to the end of the painting and regret that location, but it also adds an element of interpretation when you're painting without a line drawing beneath. So I'm just going to put in the silhouette of the nose and then come round under the nose and up to the eye. So that whole medial aspect of the nose is actually as dark as the background. And then I'm just appreciating the simple shapes here around the eye. The simple shape that's just underneath the superior or the superior orbital ridge, and the inferior part of the orbit that connects to the nose. I'm going to try and leave that as simple as possible, almost just indicating the presence of an eye. Just going to follow the ana of the nose round. It's these shapes that are going to attribute the likeness to the reference, and the position of that tubercle of the superior of the lip, the top part of the lip. So the face has just come through in this last bit here, because this dark tone has been so important for sculpting the silhouette of the face. So I really try and keep the lines that are the silhouette of the face sharp, and the lines that are the shadow within the facial features more loose, because it indicates a rounded form as opposed to a sharp silhouette form. So I'm using both the flat brush and the round brush interchangeably now. I've got them both in my hands, both have paint on them, and both are wet. So I'm trying to use the rounder brush for the fine detail, and then use the flat brush to drag that colour into the shadow. At this point I'm just going to use the flat brush now, just on the left edge of the flat brush. I'm tracking down the form formed on the side of the face, on the left side of the face, and then I'm just going to drag that into the shadow line in the middle of the painting. There's a few little details here. I like to use the flat brush for some details because it adds an element of spontaneity to them. It means they're not too thought out, too linear, and that's the same as the human form. It's not all lines and perfect forms. So I'm just going to fill this dark in again, just so I've got my eye in. So I'm just going to finish now by firming up that silhouette that I've kept going back to throughout this. But you can see it's given some nice tonal interest to the neck and really given the sense of a 3D form. Just going to sweep away from the side of the face now. Just make sure that background is very much darker than the dark tones of the face. Just going to dab the brush now. It's not something I tend to do except for around the hairline. I dab around the hairline just to break the line up, indicate the presence of hair. I'm relatively happy with the silhouette now, so I'm going to come in with the round brush and just get these final dark shapes in the face, just to highlight the features of the eye and the orbit. I think I'm pretty much coming to the end now. I'm just going to use a black ink brush pen just for the final details, and I think that'll be pretty much finished. Thank you for watching. I hope this has been useful. Do have a look at the 2 other videos on how to select a reference image and the equipment I've used if that interests you. I'm hoping to release similar videos to this, delving more into more difficult forms, more difficult head positions, and introducing colour into the work. Let me know if there's anything in particular you want me to cover, and I'll happily include that in my future content. Thanks for watching.